are joined by Paul MacNeill, who is the publisher of the Eastern Graphic, an award-winning journalist, a self-proclaimed talking head for political commentary on PEI, and many other things, and also a podcaster now as well as us. So we welcome Paul here today, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Sam. Very pleased to be here.
And not just somebody who is a self-proclaimed talking head. You've been doing that for 23 years, I think, with CBC, but almost as long as you've been in journalism. So this morning, I think 25 years, that sound right, Paul? Formerly on PEI? Well, on PEI.
Oh, yeah, I moved back in 1995. My father offered me a pay cut, so I took it.
Could not accept it.
No, could not accept the pay cut.
So tell us a little bit about that. I mentioned I was watching the National Film Board documentary, or I guess it's just
documentary. Yeah.
Yeah, on the Eastern Graphic, and it was quite a fascinating journey. Tell us a little bit about your dad, which I found quite interesting. So he actually immigrated to PEI, as I understand.
Did. That documentary, by the way, is just a fascinating glimpse of island politics. I mean, Alex Campbell is in his prime there. Mel McQuaid, I think, would be the only leader of a big party on PEI, or a small party, to charter a helicopter to get him around. And that probably cost them the election. But going back to Dad, he immigrated to Canada in 1958 from Glasgow, Scotland, grew up in the Outer Hebrides, little island called Barra. Ended up in Toronto, met my mother, who was up there working. And the idea was that they would go to British Columbia and sort of work for a priest. They would become missionaries. But the priest died in a car accident, so they had to make a decision. So they moved to Charlottetown, where Mom is from, and they just sort of landed jobs. And Dad ultimately got a job with the Journal Pioneer in Charlottetown selling advertising. And he would come into the Journal Pioneer office with story ideas that he would garner out on his sales calls. And they picked up some, and they didn't pick up others. And that sort of frustrated him. So he decided that he should start a newspaper, even though he had zero background in newspapering. And they toured around the island. They ultimately decided to start a paper in Montague in 1963, which they did, the Eastern Graphic. And from there, the paper was born. I was talking to an awards ceremony in Alberta just yesterday, and I referenced this story. Dad didn't have a journalism degree, but he had the best instincts I've ever seen of anyone. And he was sort of guided by general rules throughout his career. And one of those rules was, if an atomic bomb drops in Charlottetown, he's interested in the fallout. And so what he meant by that, and is still relevant, is perhaps more relevant today, was a good community newspaper doesn't follow where the television camera is. It doesn't follow radio. It doesn't follow the daily newspaper. It goes out and it covers its community, warts and all. So that means going to meetings no one else wants to go to, writing it up, holding public bodies to account, celebrating the achievements in your community, mourning when the community needs to mourn, and just trying to be a reflection back onto the community. And we still try to do that today.
So Island Press is, I guess, what was started at that time, and it's diversified into a number of different publications. The industry has changed a lot over the years, but what are some of the publications that have been issued by Island Press over the years?
Well, right now we have four. We have the Eastern Graphic, the West Prince Graphic. We have the Island Farmer, and that's been around for 30 some years, almost 40 years. And we have Atlantic Post Calls now, purchased that from Transcon a number of years ago. So we basically are a niche player. Over the years, we've had publications that Atlantic Gig, which covered the music scene in Atlantic Canada, and we had Atlantic Fish Farming, which covered aquaculture. And as those industries evolved, we exited it. But we've done a pretty good job of sort of serving niche markets.
And continue to today. Now you've evolved beyond just journalism, but I did notice in your sort of background that you spent some time in Halifax at the Herald, which is a pretty substantial regional paper. Is that where you kind of cut your teeth?
Yeah, I worked for the Halifax Herald out of the Truro Bureau for about 7 years. And I think what really sort of changed the trajectory of my career and the perception of what news is, I was the first reporter outside New Glasgow to land at the Westray mine explosion on May 9th, 1992. I think I spent 9 days down in Stellarton covering that. And afterwards, we were trying to figure out how to sort of carry that story forward. And Dean Job, who's now a journalism instructor at the University of King's College in Halifax, and I teamed up to sort of do a background report on who the main players were and where did they come from. And Dean was able to sort of refine my writing and process a lot. He, rather than add words to try to make a sentence better, just sort of stick to the facts. And we came up with, we were the first two folks to be nominated for a journalism award, a written award for the Halifax Herald through the National Newspaper Awards. And the paper's been around for 100 years. So that was quite an honor. Bruce McKinnon, their amazing cartoonist,
Yep.
Has been nominated before and certainly won many times, but we were the first writers, which was a great honor.
So you've taken a successful paper and you've got some really narrow focus in some of your publications, but you've kind of transcended into a well-recognized public persona here in PEI, both through, I guess, probably radio initially and now television. Tell us how that journey sort of occurred.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm very fortunate, the opportunity that CBC has given me over the years. Donna Allen gave me a call back in 1997 and asked me to come in and test for a radio panel. And I did, and I was accepted. And in the early years, or for a lot of the years, it was me sort of versus political party appointees to the panel. So I did a lot of yelling and cutting off, and it must have been awful to listen to for a long time. They let me host the call-in show on PEI for 3 or 4 years at CBC. And then about, I guess it was about 10 years ago, they asked me if I would do the panel on Compass. So I've done the last 3 provincial elections, and they've all been a giggle because they've all been fascinating to sit and watch in real time. So, my persona has increased far beyond perhaps it's just worth, simply because of the kindness that CBC has given me over the years.
But you've been balanced. I think you're a great voice. I appreciate your commentary, and it really doesn't matter who's in government. And everybody's got a political interest of some part, but you have maintained balance. You've maintained criticism, regardless of who's in, and I think you're well respected for that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I do try to sort of just call it as I see it, and sometimes people like you and sometimes people don't. I mean, it's remarkable that when the Liberals are in power, the Tories love you, and when the Tories are in power, the Liberals love you. It's just one of those things. I think we're such a small province that there really is a need for some independent thought, because even today, people are scared to speak out against government initiatives, and just to try to be a filter to some of the really stupid stuff that you see on social media, just spewing opinions without basis in fact, calling people out. It's pretty ugly there sometimes. So I got a pretty thick skin. I don't mind that people harp at me. As a matter of fact, I always say one of the great benefits of being me and a newspaper person on PEI is people have the right to call you an arsehole in the post office or superstore or whatever. But it's a balance if you think about it. I mean, there's a lot of talking heads, and I sort of say it in a self-deprecating way, but there are a lot of talking heads who just sort of sit in their office and they don't really have contact with people who are impacted by their words. I do, and I've had some very animated discussions after the fact over the years about something I've said that has peeved somebody off, and that's fair dinkum. I mean, that's accountability.
So I'll hand it over to Sam in a minute, because he is a firm studier of political. He's got very high interest in this stuff. But when you enter politics, you have to take it for granted you're going to be criticized, and you're probably going to get some name calling. You're describing as a public a journalist maybe getting some vitriol reaction. Is that kind of something that you expected when you kind of took on
yeah, when you grew up in my household, you expected it. I mean, Dad got it a lot. So you knew it was coming. But look, I appreciate when politicians come in and they don't have that thick skin built in yet, how difficult a transition it is from being a private citizen to having your actions scrutinized. And I think, frankly, I've over the years learned to appreciate that a little bit more. Not that I don't criticize. I think I do, but I think I've learned through language to soften it, unless it's completely necessary. Look, if a politician screws up, they deserve to be called for it. And I think they would say that too. But it's a difficult task being a politician on any day.
Certainly.
Any
And
public
just
figure.
to exactly. And I think, like you said, a lot of them, maybe when you first start, you might lose a couple nights of sleep because of maybe what people say online or in the paper or whatever. But you do build up that skin eventually, and you start to say, well, maybe that's not as important as I originally thought. Switching gears a bit. So you were the founder of the Georgetown Conference, and my former boss was involved as a co-chair, I think, in the first
Yep.
session, maybe. And so that's focusing on building sustainable rural communities. So how did that kind of idea sprout, and what came of that since then?
Well, up until about 2000, late 2010, I was just your average Joe publisher, columnist sitting in an office spewing out grants every week. And in Surrey, there were a couple of fish plants that had closed. And the unemployment insurance was running out. So the provincial government's solution at the time was to call a job fair and see if they could get people to get new jobs outside of the community. And I thought, Jesus, this is a ridiculous situation. I mean, it's a photo op announcement. And even if it works, you're going to have people who live in the community being forced out of the community to find a job. So I was on the board of Newspapers Atlantic at that time. And in about a day and a half after that announcement, I had sort of written what was a manifesto, a roadmap for what I thought we needed. And what I thought we needed was a discussion independent of government on how to look at some of the big challenges our communities are facing, i.e. aging demographic, seasonal employment, reliance on government to not only solve our problems, but sort of be the deliverer and of solutions in terms of holding sort of us at ransom almost in some ways. So I went to my board and I said, I've got this idea for a conference. I want to organize it. I want Newspapers Atlantic to be the key sponsor, because if community newspapers can't support their communities, what the hell are we in business for? And my board said, yeah, how much do you want? Which I hadn't really thought of. So I said, $25,000. So they said, okay, $25,000, go organize a conference. That sort of called my bluff. I knew immediately I didn't have the skill set to organize it. So the first person I called was Wade McLaughlin, who seemed to be out of a job from my perspective at the time. He had just finished UPEI. He was writing a book on Alex Campbell. So he and I, and actually, interestingly, Dennis King was involved in the very first meeting of the Georgetown Conference. But he didn't stay too long in the organizing situation or organizing structure. But he was there. We met at a restaurant, at a little restaurant in Fortune, at a gas station, had a meal, talked it over. I made the pitch to Wade, and then he came on board full bore. And, you know, between sort of my grassroots perspective and Wade's big picture perspective and his Rolodex, we pulled off a conference that, you know, it sounds boastful, but it's really true. I mean, the first Georgetown Conference changed communities. If you go to Inverness, Cape Breton, if you go to Macadam, New Brunswick, if you go to the South Shore of Nova Scotia, if you go to Cardigan, the Three Rivers area, there's all kinds. Three Rivers is a direct result of the Georgetown Conference. The Cloggeroo Folk Festival is a direct result of the Georgetown Conference. So what it did, because we didn't allow politicians in the room, it allowed people to figure out what they could do in their own community. We made people apply, and as part of the application process, we asked them, you know, what do you intend to do in your community? Where do you see it going? And it was just an amazing event to watch, not because I was involved with it, but because it really empowered people from the grassroots up to look at solutions that they could push forward in their own communities.
And I often think sometimes it's a little too easy to not blame government for issues, but if the actual grassroots aren't coming up with the actual ideas, then there's nowhere to turn to. So to be able to kind of at least make that stepping stone to say, here's where we're going to start. We don't know what's going to happen with the Georgetown Conference, but it's a start, and we can start thinking about ideas outside the box so we don't have to go, I don't know, bully government about. But and I
Well,
think
I think government benefits when people come up with great ideas themselves, because it takes the onus off. The report in Nova Scotia that was written by the former president of Acadia University, it indicated, and it was looking at sort of the future of rural communities, almost similar on a similar track to when we were doing ours. One of the key issues that he raised was that too often government tries to pick winners. And it's because, a new government comes in and they say, we want to promote this industry. So then the whole bureaucracy shifts to try to support that political directive. But when individuals and individual communities can identify issues themselves, try to map out a solution on how to make it a reality, and then go to government, isn't that a better process for everyone involved? Government can take credit for helping, communities get a project that they want, and the communities grow.
And I think we're seeing a lot of that now through COVID as well, with I guess the business continuity group, like kind of like a private group outside of the Premier's task force that's saying, okay, well, here's our plan, here's our ideas, do something with it.
Well, the continuity group is probably the size that the task force should have been. Because when you get to a group that's, high 20s in numbers, and it becomes the checklist of who's on, who's not on. Interestingly, that group doesn't have any representation from the construction industry or road builders, which if you want to get your economy back up and running ASAP, you may want to talk to those folks.
Or Summerside. I think I've heard criticism.
Yes, but they added a couple from Summerside. But the problem is, by the time you get 25 people around a table and you introduce yourselves, and
the meeting's over.
You can't do anything. So I have zero expectations of the Economic Council. If they break up into subgroups that are sort of focused specifically on targeted issues and industries, perhaps we can see something real come out of it. But I wouldn't hold my breath.
And I made the same argument a couple weeks ago on our podcast, how the idea of a jury, there's only 12 people, because if you had any more people, there would just be too many ideas and too many things floating around, that you need to concise it and refine it to a smaller, like you said, subgroups, or a smaller overall group.
Correct.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, you go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say Kevin Murphy's group. I don't know a whole lot about it. I did see him on Compass, I think, last night. That's the tourism industry, which is so dramatically impacted by this, sort of trying to figure out a roadmap themselves for how to move forward. I mean, when I was talking to the Premier, he said, if that was a month ago, if we could get to 10% of our total revenue, we'd consider it a success. Well, 10% is $50 million. Tourism's a $500 million industry. We might get a little bit higher than that if we have sort of a multi-provincial bubble created, but we'll see. I mean, I think Kevin and his group deserve credit for sort of taking that on and driving down their own road with it.
I think you have to. You see groups now, I think they've got to be empowered to manage their own responsibilities, because government can't address all the challenges they're faced with. So transitioning a little bit, so I guess you did this Georgetown Conference. There's been a couple of sessions. You've really tried to stem a tsunami that was going to urbanize, and that's happening every place. Regionally, we're urbanizing to Halifax. Provincially, maybe we're urbanizing to the bigger cities. What are the next steps, Paul? And do you have plans for more Georgetown conferences, or what do you think the communities can do to empower and maintain population?
I don't know if I have the energy. I mean, it was an all-encompassing. It just took every moment of my time to organize those, because we did little things. Well, they were big things. Like, if you do a regional conference, you need Newfoundlanders. So how do you get a Newfoundlander to a conference with the cost of transportation? We chartered a plane both times, 38 seats. We charged Newfoundland attendees, I think, $250 return to Charlottetown, just to give. Yeah, so that speaks to that speaks to the ability to raise funds, and Wade was instrumental in that originally, but B, just the legwork that's needed. I mean, I wonder as we come out of COVID, whether some of those assumptions about urbanization are going to turn out to be reversed. We got a provincial government talking about taking a third of the provincial public service and letting them work from home, or at least in government offices in rural communities. Um, that's not going to be good for downtown Charlottetown, but it'll be darn good for Tignish. It'll be darn good for Cardigan, because the spin-off effect is, you've got employees who don't have to drive for an hour and 15 minutes or more every day total, which gives them more time to volunteer, to be engaged in their communities. So I think that's important. And I also just think that one of the lessons of COVID is that local matters. If you lose one job in a local community, it has a big impact. And COVID showed that in spades. So, people are interested in buying local products. People are interested in supporting local businesses. And I think our challenge as sort of rural communities is to make sure that that momentum moves forward.
So driving a lot of this discourse is the legislature and our politicians. You're an observer of the legislature. What do you see happening in this new coalition environment? I mean, maybe it's breaking down a bit, but how have they done this session?
Well, look, I think all three parties have done really quite well. The opposition parties deserve a lot of credit for not sitting on the sidelines during COVID. I mean, they were involved in 2 of 3 cabinet level committees, which met daily and were updated daily on our provincial response. But what they didn't do was sort of hammer the government for initiatives during COVID. And I think that was important. I do think the provincial government, almost without exception, did a good job. One of the great things that I hope we can keep going forward is, as someone who's watched government literally for decades, I hate to say now, one of the big issues with government is that's where great issues went to die many times, because the bureaucracy could slow something down and to the point where it was never executionable. And if they finally got something out at the other end, by the time they had their meetings and their papers and their inter-office emails, it was so watered down that it was completely ineffective. What's happened during COVID is the government had to respond. It had to get programs out. The bureaucracy was incredibly nimble and flexible, and they deserve immense credit for that. And I hope we don't go back to where we were, because a nimble bureaucracy is a relevant bureaucracy. And we need a relevant bureaucracy in this province.
I think the idea around like crisis creates opportunity, it's a perfect example. Like, obviously we don't want COVID to happen, but it creates those opportunities that things can get pushed through faster, and kind of legislation that maybe wouldn't have even been thought of before, that it can be pushed forward and brought to the forefront to say, no, we're doing this now because we have to.
The other great thing, Sam, is that, politicians and bureaucrats over the years have become so fearful of failure that they delayed doing things that they knew should have been done. The great thing is that this government and the opposition parties during COVID proceeded with initiatives that didn't work as they initially were conceived. Closing liquor stores. Stephen Myers had a half-hour notice before he closed the liquor stores from the public health office. We've seen with the rollout of the seasonal residents that it wasn't fully flushed out at the start, and they did get some credit, some criticism because of it, but nobody's jumping all over them. It hasn't stopped them from moving forward, and I think that's important, because everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes. You guys make mistakes. Government makes mistakes. But when we have a system that allows necessary movement to take place because of fear of failure, that's a system that is failing.
And I think we'll have hiccups with the idea of the Atlantic bubble, but like you said, you have to try and open up. You have to try and push forward. Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck complaining about not making any money or losing jobs or whatever the case may be. So I agree with what you said. You have to make those hiccups, those mistakes to move forward as a society, as a province.
Absolutely. It's going to be a long winter if we don't get some type of economy rolling. Because 40% of our $2 billion plus budget comes in the form of federal equalization payments. We don't know where the federal government, at some point, austerity is going to be the name of the day, game of the day. And if we don't have an economy that's sort of humming along, at least at some level back to where it was, we may never get back to where we were for a good number of years. we're in trouble. We could be in big trouble. So I'm more concerned about the economy in November and December and January and February and March than I am right now.
And I think austerity is something somebody's going to have to grapple with federally, provincially, and there won't be a tax base, unfortunately, because I think you look at seasonal tourism operations, you look at restaurants that are operating at 30% capacity, they're just not going to have the returns to fill the provincial coffers. What do you think about an election? So, we've got federal, provincial governments that are both, maybe fragile. Nobody wants to go to election. Nobody can afford one. Do you think anybody's going to pop that trigger?
I hope not. The Liberals are without a leader. None of the three parties have the money to run an election. I don't think, frankly, there's a desire to go right yet. If you're the Green Party and if you're the Liberals, and you know that the King government is riding high based upon their response to COVID, but that was the easy part in a lot of ways. Responding and spending money is the easy part. We'll see how many Islanders are happy with the King government in 2 years. It's possible they'll be as happy, but we've seen how quickly the tide can turn on an issue like seasonal residents. So what happens when we have to start redefining healthcare or education or whatever it may be? That's going to cause discussion and debate, and discussion and debate causes people to think about alternatives.
Here's a question, I guess, when you look at the legislature and what's going to happen. Do you think there'll be a budget implemented here before the session closes? How do you think that's going to be reacted to? Will they close and come back? Are they ready to do a budget?
Look, I don't know. My guess right now, and this is just a guess, is they'll probably just go through and get it all done. I mean, Darlene Compton said, about 10 days ago that a budget would be delivered in 3 weeks. She's projecting a deficit of $175 million. I think that's probably quite low for the reasons you just indicated, that we don't know how many businesses are going to be around to be paying taxes this year. And we don't know the level of taxation that we'll be able to achieve. So there's going to be a lot of discussion with the federal government, I think, at every provincial and municipal level to figure out a financial path towards sustainability, because it's not just provincial governments that are going to grapple with this. It's going to be municipal governments, and the trickle-down impact on programs and services in the coming months and years is going to be very significant in all probability.
Sam, you've watched the legislature closely. Is there any motions or bills that have passed that you found kind of stimulating?
Maybe not stimulating. I think they wasted a lot of time on some of them, and it might be through whoever's fault. But I think, the idea around the biggest one, I guess, that came from this past week was the changing of the legislative hours, and that was debated for a number of days. To what extent, I don't know, but it is passed now. And I think the government might even thought that, this is going to be a 3-day sitting, we're going to get in and out, but now it's been 3 full weeks, and I'm sure it'll go into next week too before anything happens. So I think we will see a budget pass, but the legislation that has been discussed has been kind of irrelevant to COVID, in my opinion.
Yeah, a lot of things are peripheral to COVID. The whole idea of reducing changing the hours of operation has been around for since 2009. Mm-hmm. And I would look at that debate and the time expended on it and say, that's not a productive way to deal with this issue. There is an issue with how do we not only attract new Canadians, Indigenous women to run for political parties, but actually win. And that's an issue with the Liberal and the Tory parties and how they nominate candidates in large part. I mean, if you go back to Wade McLaughlin, he tried to get a significant number of women nominated. And in a few pointed circumstances, they were sort of beat by the good old boy, for lack of a better phrase, because there's an issue with how Liberals and Tories don't nominate anyone because they're the best and brightest and can do the most for the province. A lot of times they're nominated because they've been hanging around the party back rooms for a long time, and they've got chits to cash in, and that's an unfortunate reality. And I don't care what time the legislature starts or what time it ends, that amendment is not going to change it.
No.
So if you want to deal with real issues, deal with real issues. I thought Gordon McNeely this session was very strong in terms of raising.
That's because he's so fit.
Well,
He's doing his
he is.
fitness regime every day.
He's very fit. But look, Gord is not. He's a really smart, engaging guy. But if you look at his record through the first year and a bit of this government of being elected, there's not a whole lot you can point to. But in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I mean, he's really gotten his sea legs, and he delivered 2 member statements that were both powerful. And when he called out the Green Party for sort of invoking Black Lives Matters during a debate on changing hours of the legislature, that was powerful stuff. It's not often, you hear the leader of the opposition say my words were clumsy and apologize, but Peter Bevan Baker did. And so credit to both of them, but especially credit to Gord McNeely for so articulately raising the issue and sort of the obvious contradiction of what was going on in the legislature and the disconnect with the lack of conversations that we're having with people that we say we want to be in the House. I mean, look at the provincial civil service. It's white. It's men and women in senior management positions. And, in a lot of cases, it's people getting jobs because of who you know. Our Chinese population, our Asian population has increased exponentially in the last decade. Do you see Chinese represented in the public service? Not in senior management positions.
Not much diversity. Now, I think the one of the people in the Public Service Commission, TLAC, has been there for a number of years from Sri Lanka. But yeah, there's not much diversity, and that needs to change.
But the list should be longer than one.
Well, no question. Yeah, you just have to look at the mosaic, and you can draw a conclusion.
Absolutely.
But look, you've been a observer of politics many years, an actual pundit, probably 23. What do you think is going to happen here in politics and PEI over the next year?
Well, I do think that the trajectory of politics has changed. I mean, it was just bitter and dirty and nasty during the McLaughlin years, into the Giz years. Before that, the opposition has a role. And it's important, and we can't diminish it at all. They have to their job is to hold government to account. But it doesn't mean opposition parties need to be petty. It doesn't mean the government needs to be petty towards the opposition. So I think Dennis King has achieved a significant notch in his belt for just changing the tone by and large. We're seeing some sort of more spitfire from them, and that's not a bad thing. I suspect as we get into seeing where money is being allocated in the budget, that will set off more skirmishes, because people will want to protect their turf. People will defend people who need defending. Government will be put on the defensive. And I think he can do that without going back to uber nasty.
I would have to agree. Like, I think Dennis King's tone with the kind of everyone's inclusive, let's stop I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, I guess, is what kind of his mantra has been. But I think it definitely changed the trajectory of violent politics. And now to go back to what it was would be near impossible. It'd be like putting toothpaste back in the tube, because no one wants that. We're sick of kind of the nitty gritty, always argue in politics. We want more kind of solution-based politicians.
Well, you didn't see that this week with the discussion on changing legislative hours, right? That the House spent an inordinate amount of time talking about something, and at the end of the day, is it a real tangible action that will help with what it was supposed to help with? Probably not so much. I mean, there were a whole bunch of recommendations in that report in 2009. How many have been implemented? I think one of the interesting things to watch, pardon me, will be to see how Dennis King as a premier responds to the transition from the pivot to from spending to governing, sort of in a austere manner. Not everybody has the skill set that people bring to the table. I think Dennis King's skill set was perfect for the COVID response. He's open, he's transparent, he's got a very strong communication skills. Wasn't as strong when he was criticized a few times, but can he do the same when government is in cutback mode, not spend mode? That'll be an interesting thing to watch, and that may determine more than anything else how successful the PC party is in the long term.
And I would have to agree. And I think
and even just frustration from this COVID environment.
Yeah, and crisis kind of shapes leaderships, and how they're remembered would be through the crisis, not through the good days. But yeah, anyways, Paul, we appreciate you coming on today, and we thankful for your insight and all you have to contribute to Island Life on PEI.
Appreciate it very much, boys. Onward and upward.
And don't forget you've got a podcast, Paul. So let's tune into your
podcast.
It's
a podcast is because life is local, and it's on. It's anywhere you can find your podcasts. It's also on our website, peicanada.com. There's one episode up now. It's just a recent start. It was a great interview with Premier Dennis King, and there's a few more in the works. So we'll be adding liberally, small L, in the near future.
Sounds like a plan.
Have a great day, boys.
See ya.